Hi, everyone. As you said, my name is Josh from University of Illinois, Materials Science and Engineering Department. I'm going to work with Andre Schleife. Today I want to talk to you about some of the work we've done exploring the optical properties of a material, a very specific material, which is methyl-ammonia lead-iodide, which has gotten a lot of media attention lately and has very particular optical properties that seem to be a source of a mystery in the field. And we hope to shed some light on this. So first, I'd like to thank my funding agency, NSF, for their generous funding of this project. I'd like to thank NCSA and the Blue Water Supercomputer for actually allowing us to perform our calculations. And finally, I'd like to thank the Schleife Research Group for their support and knowledge. So solar energy has gotten a lot of press in the past decades about being a viable energy source for the decades to come. And there are two major issues with solar energy that need to be addressed. The first is the infrastructural issue. How do we actually distribute solar energy around our grid? And the second is how do we actually make solar panels more efficient, so the actual material science problem. In our group, we zoom way in. We look at how do solar cell materials take a photon and actually convert it to usable electronic energy. So the material I want to talk to you about today is called methyl-ammonia lead-iodide. It's a perovskite solar cell material. So you have kind of this cage made out of iodide, and inside of these octahedrals you have a lead ion. And between these cages, you have these floating organic ions, these methyl-ammonia ions. These are cations, right? And they carry a dipole charge. And so these are actually really easy to synthesize. They have high optical absorptivity, and they have a very long carrier mean free path on the order of a micron. So that's how long the electron can travel without being scattered. But there are some caveats. Specifically, they have poorly understood optical nature. Second is that they contain poisonous lead. And the third, which kind of augments the second concern, is that they're unstable in ambient conditions or moist conditions. These are two major concerns, or three major concerns in the field. And we would like to start addressing these concerns with first principles investigation. So actually starting at the atomic and electronic level and explaining from quantum mechanics how we can actually resolve this. And today I'll focus on the optical nature of these materials. And to do this, as our diving board, we use density functional theory to start. And density functional theory has kind of exploded onto the field since the 90s as a way to really begin looking at all sorts of atomic level phenomena, from defects, magnetism, et cetera. And today, we'll focus specifically on the optical properties. So a little bit of background on DFT in case anyone's not familiar with the theory. So say we want to start with quantum theory. It's an exact or numerical analysis of atoms and electrons. And it uses something called the many-body wave function to calculate observables. This, unfortunately, is not solvable for many problems in the field. As you learn in a quantum 1 class, the most advanced problem you can solve analytically is the hydrogen atom, 2 particles. So what do we need to do? We need to go to more advanced numerical approaches. Density functional theory is one of those numerical approaches. What we say is that instead of thinking about all the electrons interacting, let's create a mean field, the electron density, hence density functional theory. And each electron will interact with that electron density instead. Now, there are some issues. We lose that particle-particle interaction, which is critical for many of the observables we want to actually measure. Second is we lose something which is the part of the electron-electron interaction called the correlation and exchange, two kind of jargon terms in the field. And we can ask more about that later if you're interested. So we replace the Schrodinger equation in quantum mechanics with something called the Kohn-Shaam equation, which is an analytic self-consistent equation for the energy of a set of atoms and electrons. This treats the electrons, again, as independent particles moving in a mean field. And it also reduces the electron-hole, or electron-electron, or electron-hole accuracy. And holes are the absence of electrons. So how do we visualize the results for optics in density functional theory? Well, we look at two things. One is the band structure. And the band structure basically says we have valence states, which are occupied at the ground state. And upon optical excitation, electrons move up to the conduction state. And they leave behind what's called a hole, so aptly named. And it's effectively just a positive space. So the electron can absorb light, jump up to conduction states. Most basic process you need to understand. The second is something called the imaginary dielectric function. And you can imagine this sort of like the absorption spectra of the material. It tells you as a function of photon energy, how likely are we to absorb a photon in our system. And this is our density functional theory versus experimental results, and it's a complete failure. So what do we need to do to treat this? This is where we actually get into kind of the nitty-gritty physics that we need to address and why we need to go beyond density functional theory, small-scale computations, and move up to something bigger. The issue in the physics is that, again, we've ignored that explicit two-particle interaction. What happens when you get these optical excitations is the electron actually sees the hole it left behind, and it binds. And this quasi-particle is called an exciton. You can almost imagine like a hydrogen atom rotating, right? That actually happens inside these materials. And this is not at all treated in density functional theory. So we need a theory to move beyond this. And there's a well-accepted theory in the field that is called the Bethe-Salpeter equation. And what this does is it treats the electron-hole problem. It actually originated in field theory to treat bound particle issues, and it's been reformulated to a matrix form for condensed matter physics, specifically for optics. So what happens is we actually have to build this giant matrix of interactions, a Hamiltonian, excitonic Hamiltonian, if you will. On the diagonal, we have our band structure, independent particle structure. It could be DFT or GW or hybrid functionals, as long as it's independent particles. On the off diagonal, we have interactions. So those are the exchange and the screen Coulomb interaction terms. These are very large matrices, on the order of 100,000 for the medium-sized calculations we've done thus far, and we'll get bigger in the future. Requires at least 62 nodes right now for minimum efficiency for our larger unit cells, and will require more than 100 nodes per run. We'll do many of these runs in the future for more advanced or more accurate calculations. So the matrix looks something like this. Again, on the diagonal, we have our typical band structure, conduction minus valence states for various K points in our Brillouin zone. On the off diagonal, we have our interaction terms. And from this matrix, we need to get observables. And there are two major observables we need to keep in mind when thinking about optical properties of materials. The first is the optical spectrum, right? As I showed you before, the imaginary dielectric function gives you the function of the absorptivity versus the photon energy. And we use a time propagation method, and we actually don't have to actually explicitly find the eigenstates of this matrix, which is extremely convenient. The second is something called the exciton binding energies. And this is how much are the electron holes stuck together. And this is extremely important. If they're really stuck together, we cannot separate them, and we can't get current. That defeats the solar cell, right? This needs to be a relatively low value. And it's important that we understand why this value is small in these materials. All right, so let's apply the Bethe-Salpeter equation. To our surprise, we actually get a worse fit to experiments. Now, the Bethe-Salpeter equation has been around for a long time, and it's been well explored in the field, and has massive success in replicating the optical properties. So why are we getting a worse fit? This is a big mystery, and it's actually a mystery that permeates the field right now. What is our formalism really missing? There's a lot of debate, and we hope to shed some light on this debate in this talk. So there are two phenomena that we have to treat very explicitly. And this is something, two things called the spin-orbit coupling in the material, and something called the lattice screening. And the lattice screening is kind of the big topic of this talk, which is the new thing we've added in, which we believe is kind of the way to really understand how these materials work on the optical level. So spin-orbit coupling, a few of you are probably familiar with it. If not, what it is basically is that when you have really heavy atoms, the potential gradient is very strong. And what happens is spin degrees of freedom interact with the angular momentum of the electron. You actually get an energy term, a contribution from this interaction. This is not explicitly treated in density functional theory usually, so what you can do is when you do treat this, and VASP actually has the capability, the code we use for density functional theory, to introduce the spin interaction. And what happens is we actually double the number of bands. And it's important to remember that each of the bands is actually two states, because the original density functional theory is spin independent. So we have degenerate bands. And what happens is these split those degeneracies. So you actually see bands split into two more bands in the system. And it dramatically shifts the energy levels, especially for heavy ions. Lead, remember, is a very heavy ion. Interestingly enough, imagine you have two bands. You have one optical excitations. When you split each of those, you have four bands. You have four optical excitations. So it quadruples the cost of the calculation. So you can take a look. I don't know if the color contrast is conducive to seeing this, but black is the density functional theory results for the band structure, and blue is the spin-orbit coupled. You can see a massive shift in the energy levels. These change them dramatically, mostly because the conduction state characteristic is lead, right? This changes the effective mass, which will change the excitonic properties, and it also changes the number of bands, which will change, in the end, the peak position of our optical absorption. Problem 2 is really the critical problem we hope to discuss, and that is that the lattice of methyl-ammonia lead-iodide is highly polarizable. What happens is at low frequencies, you can polarize the lead-iodide cage, right, and get a low-frequency optical response. And when I say polarize, what I mean is by applying an electric field, you literally distort the lattice. You move charges, right? And the methyl-ammonia, the cation, that organic cation, responds to high frequency. So we have response from all the way from optical response from 3 terahertz all the way to 100 terahertz. Right? There's a wide range of polarizabilities and responses in the crystal we can look at. And this will have a significant effect on the electronic and optical properties of the material. So we measure these 2 ways. The electronic response, the electronic polarizability, how much we can shift the electron clouds in the material, is measured by a number called the high-frequency dielectric constant. And this is epsilon infinity. So it's about 6 in this material experimentally. And then there's also the low-frequency dielectric constant. This is called epsilon 0, which includes the lattice response. And in materials where these are close together, you don't necessarily need to explicitly treat the lattice response. You could use the electronic response, which is canonically done in the Bethe-Salpeter code. It's taken as an axiom at this point. However, in this material, instead of, say, a 5 to 7 split, we have a 5 to 25 in computation and a 6 to 32 split in experiments. This is huge. This is a very large response, and it's important that we acknowledge this and really try to incorporate this into our model. So just a visualization of how lattice response and lattice screening of the electron-hole works. Say we have light coming into our material. We can form this exciton, this bound electron-hole pair, right? What happens is these are now bound. They're not free to carry charge, which we need. What happens is these charged quantities in our crystal, they can respond to the external electric field, the light, and they can polarize, they can move. And when these move, we actually induce a local field. And this local field will actually screen the electron-hole interaction. It places an electric field basically in the way and kind of cuts short that electric interaction between the electron and the hole. And this phenomena is called lattice screening. And what will happen is if the screening is high enough, the electron and hole can now travel their merry ways and carry current. This is exactly what we want. And this is exactly what's not predicted right now in the field, even though it's seen experimentally. So again, a bit of background we discussed before. Epsilon infinity is the high-frequency dielectric constant, and that's readily available in density functional theory. But we must add lattice screening somehow. And this is measured by, again, the low-frequency dielectric constant. And this is fairly difficult to find in density functional theory. You can run density functional perturbation theory and get a decent approximation. We've done this, and we get what everyone else gets, about 25, right? And this is unitless. And the experimental value is 32. There's another issue, which is that typically in the field, people discuss a Q approaches 0 dependence on lattice response, which is that only particles at the same K point, so electrons and holes right on top of each other in that band diagram, can really only respond to the lattice screening, right? However, there's some proof out there from some older papers and some older works that this is actually not the case. And so what we're going to opt to do is apply a model dielectric function that we actually use for the electronic response when we usually run Bethe-Salpeter equation, like we did when we got that failure before I showed you. And we're going to use the lattice response instead of the electronic response. So normally here we would plug in epsilon infinity, which is 5.5 from our DFT calculations. And then we have epsilon 0, which is 25 or 32 from experiment. And we're going to go ahead and pick 32. Since we're using a model dielectric function, this is kind of a proof of concept at this point. So let's see what happens. And it's been proven that this model dielectric function really fits well what's called the RPA model dielectric function, which is a much more rigorous way to get this dielectric response. And it's much cheaper, and we can do these calculations much more quickly without getting the RPA dielectric function. So we have a set of theories. One is the optical response, the excitonic Hamiltonian that we need to build. Two, spin-orbit coupling, getting that band splitting. That's very important. And number three is introducing this lattice screening through this model dielectric function. So let's run this. First, we start with DFT to get the eigenvalues and the eigenfunctions, so the energy states and then the wave functions effectively. This is a relatively cheap calculation. We don't need to run this on blue letters. But the next part, we do need to run on blue letters. Right now, we run on 62 nodes, basically because of a bug in our code. But we're addressing that actively right now, and we'll be able to run on much more node space in the future. The rank, again, is right now 100,000. This is due to go up. And the storage is about 100 gigabytes for this matrix. Again, will go up in the future. Then finally, we want to get observables. So we have this giant matrix, not a very convenient object to move around. So what we want to do is basically kind of take this and manipulate it and get the observables out. So what we need to do, as I said before, is get the spectrum and the exciton binding energies. So this is kind of our three-step approach, our workflow, to how we actually perform these calculations. And let's see what we get. So we can start with density functional theory. Again, failure. The typical Bethe-Salpeter code, as most people apply it, drastic failure. Now when we incorporate spin-orbit coupling, you see this yellow curve here, we're starting to move in the right direction of the experiment. But what's really surprising, was actually shocking to us when we saw this, is that when you dial up that lattice screening, we fit the peak position of the experiment almost perfectly. This is very surprising to us, mostly because it's a very qualitative model. But there's a lot of literature out there, which we're exploring now, that actually justifies using this method. And we're very excited. This could represent a new method to actually examine these polar semiconductors for optical applications. And if we keep getting these spectra right and we can justify this quantitatively, this will be a powerful computational method. So there's another quantity I talked about besides the spectrum, which is the exciton binding energy. Now this is a very non-trivial task to find this. What we need to do is very closely sample a space where we find that minimum energy exciton. And what we need to do is we need to use a lot of K points effectively. And calculation costs goes cubic with number of K points. So things get pretty hairy pretty fast. What we do is that in the limit of infinite K points, we will see that we should approach the exciton binding energy. So you can see our metric here is 1 over the number of K points, and we have the exciton binding energy on the y-axis. And at a certain point, we get this turnaround. And that's more numerical than physical. But once we get this turnaround, it's kind of accepted in the field that you take a linear fit, extrapolate to 0, and that's your exciton binding energy. And what happens is one of our limiting steps is that the wave functions grow rapidly with number of K points that you use. And there's a little bit of a bottleneck in our method right now. But once we handle this, I think they're upgrading the nodes memory to 128 gigs on a few of them. That'll actually help us a lot with this issue. We'll be able to go twice as big with the wave functions. And so with this improvement, we really will be able to hopefully converge this value even better. And mind you, there are 3 phases of this material. The cubic, which I've shown you results for thus far, is kind of the just above room temperature phase that a lot of people explore. It's also the smallest unit cell, just 12 atoms. That's fairly easy to look at in DFT. The other 2, to incorporate the proper symmetries, you need 48 atoms. And this is prohibitive to look at the exciton binding energies for those systems. So we'll need to address these issues. And once we figure out these two bugs, getting the wave functions up to a higher value, and also running on more than 62 nodes, we'll be able to tackle these problems. We're confident. All right, so a bit of a short presentation, but our future goals, one, I discussed beforehand that the perovskite itself is actually unstable in moist conditions, which is a huge issue. I mean, imagine someone trying to sell you one of these to put on your house and saying, well, there's lead and it's gonna degrade, and but don't worry about it too much, right? This is a big issue. This is unacceptable from an engineering standpoint. So if we can understand the optical response of these materials, can we look at other stoichiometries without lead that will preserve these effects? Lattice screening to split up those electron and holes and get this high connectivity, high mean free path. And these tin perovskites that we're starting to look at now are not so well explored experimentally. Some people have looked at them, but they're not as popular, mostly because we don't have a good formalism to analyze the one that is more popular, which is methyl-ammonia lead-iodide. And so we hope with this model and more quantitative approach that we're developing now, that we'll be able to start tackling these and really starting to communicate to the field their viability as solar cells. The second, there's some debate in the field about where the screening really comes from. In our lab, my advisor developed in some of his PhD work the capability to look at partially filled bands and their effects on the excitonic properties of materials. There are, at ambient conditions, free carriers in the material, and they will affect the optical properties, even though they are relatively low concentrations. So we will look at this and see how that affects the spectrum as well. All right, so conclusions from this talk. Two standard issues are at hand here. We need to look at excitonic, aka optical effects in the materials, so electrons, holes binding together, and spin-orbit coupling. These are well acknowledged in the field. Most people know that you need to do this. But the part that we are trying to introduce is, again, this lattice screening. And we've shown great success in using this lattice screening to replicate the experimental spectrum and predict the experimental spectrum. We need very large data sets for more accurate calculations. Say if we want to go into the UV range, or if we want to converge those exciton binding energies to high accuracy, we're going to need to go higher than 62 nodes, higher than 100 gigabytes. And Blue Waters provides the capability to do that. We also do many of these calculations, so it's not just one 62 node job and we're done. We've run probably hundreds of these at this point. And finally, I would really like to thank Blue Waters and NCSA. They've been critical to the success of this project. And without them, we wouldn't have the computational power to actually complete this study.